Good morning, everyone. So when we're discussing urban issues, it's common to hear about growing cities, booming populations, the issues of water management. But bees, I present to you an overview of the studies that we've been involved with in the group on urban pollination in ATREE. And we've basically been working in the Bangalore landscape. So I'll just highlight some interesting findings and some learnings that we've picked up along the way. So bees mean business. We all know that bees are important, but let's take a very quick look at exactly how important. Of course, bees render a very crucial ecosystem service. They pollinate nearly 90% of all flowering plants. They also, of course, pollinate food plants. So agricultural productivity is a huge thing that's affected by bees. Nearly, say, 3/4 of all the food that you eat depends on pollination. Livelihoods, of course. So farmers and people working in businesses that are dependent on agricultural produce also depend on pollinators for their livelihoods. And coming to nutrition, a lot of the plants that bees and other pollinators pollinate are rich sources of micronutrients. So these could be vitamins and antioxidants and others. So all these foods are typically fruits, vegetables, nuts, and oilseeds, all of which need some animal-mediated pollination. And of course, there are lots of pollinators. There are around 20,000 species, invertebrate and vertebrate. We're going to talk about bees because they're a dominant group. So this brings us to this nexus, the pollinator, food, urban agriculture, and nutrition nexus. What's interesting to see here is that a lot of the plants that are pollinator supportive are amenable to growing in cities. Like you heard Chandani talk about urban agriculture. These plants are quite relevant to urban agriculture because they have lower space requirements than your traditional, say, cereal plants. So you could consider growing them in your backyard if you so wish. So what's happening around the world? What does research tell us? What's happening to pollinators? One thing that's noticed from across the globe is that there are reports of pollinator loss. And of course, this is highly concerning. Most of these reports are local. So you have these reports from temperate and tropical regions, and they all talk about more regional pollinator losses. But if you look at the big picture, you see that this is a recurrent theme. What is interesting and perhaps concerning at the same time is the fact that agriculture is becoming more and more pollinator dependent. By that, I mean that the area under which pollinator dependent crops are grown is increasing. It's increasing by 300% according to FAO. So what does research on pollinators tell us? Firstly, there aren't too many studies that span temporal and spatial scales. Those studies that do exist focus on agricultural productivity and not so much about the pollinator community. A lot of the attention that pollinators get is centered around honeybees, and this is from the angle of honey production. But when you're only looking at honeybees, you're ignoring a very large group of non-honeybee pollinators, which are really very efficient pollinators at that. Right, so we have all these figures. We know that the value of animal-mediated pollination in India is around 4 lakh crores. It's probably a little more now. This was in 2017. The value of just insects to pollination in agricultural markets in India is something around 1 lakh crores. Again, this is a conservative estimate. But when you hear about these figures, I, and perhaps you also wonder how relevant this is to you and me. I mean, how much do we really depend on pollinators? We wanted to ask this at a more local level. We conducted a survey, an online survey of diets, and this was done within Bangalore. We see that the purple bit, that's around 45 to 55 or perhaps even 60% of our foods are pollinator dependent. So the purple bit is just actually pollinator dependent, as in highly pollinator dependent, but there's also the 2 shades of green. So that those are crops that are partially dependent or are dependent only for seed production. But of course, if you add all of that up, the figure is quite high. If you want to look a little closer at what are these food groups that are really dependent on pollination, we have this figure. It talks about food consumption frequency, so that's the usage score, and we also look at categories of pollinator dependence on the y-axis. So typically, those foods that are in the top right corner of the figure would be highly pollinator dependent and very frequently used in consumption, daily consumption. So these would be things like vegetables and spices, also fruits, cooking oils, also pulses, which is a very integral part of Indian diets. We also thought that it would be interesting to look at cultivation of these crops around Bangalore. So this is from the Directorate of Economics and Statistics, Government of Karnataka. So we just wanted to see what's the trend in pollinator-dependent crops. And the purple and aqua colored lines are pollinator-dependent and partially dependent crops. And you see a bit more of a decline in the cultivation of these crops around Bangalore compared to pollinator-independent crops, which is the red line. Of course, there are lots of reasons for this. But this sort of prompted us to think about more local ways of producing food. And as we all know, urban agriculture is the in thing. So if we're going to go down this path, we want to know if bees can live in cities. How do they respond to urbanization? So in this study, we looked at a gradient of urbanization. As you can see, there are sites spread north and south, radiating from the center of the city. And we sampled for bees using pan traps. We were quite surprised to see that urban areas reported highest bee species richness, followed by transition and rural areas. We also see that urban spaces seem to be home to lesser known bees, rare bees, in few numbers, but still these are present. Also, what was a very important outcome of our study, we also looked at floral diversity. We assessed flora around our sampling sites. It was the fact that urban areas had a much higher floral diversity than rural and transition areas. And of course, perhaps not very surprisingly, we see that bee communities respond closely to floral resources. So urban areas have higher bee diversity and also, of course, higher floral diversity. So the graph on the right talks about bee species abundance across the gradient. Red is urban, yellow is transition or peri-urban, and green is rural. And the graph on the right-hand side bottom talks about floral abundance of bee-supportive families of plants. So, is urban agriculture viable in Bangalore? How viable is it? What are some say challenges or key issues that we need to look out for? So this online survey that we did was 2-part. The second part deals with urban agriculture. So we asked people about their gardens and what they grow and if they have gardens. More than half of the respondents said that yes, they do have gardens. I think Chandani also mentioned this, that urban agriculture is a growing trend in Bangalore and several other cities all over the world. We also see that nearly 1/3 of them are already growing fruits and vegetables in the garden. We're interested in fruits and vegetables because these are pollinator supportive and pollinator dependent also. We were also curious to know where the garden space is located. Because of course, when you say Bangalore, any other city for that matter, space is a constraint. Not surprisingly, around half of people, of the respondents say that they have gardens outside the house. So that would be the front yard, backyard, or around the house. That's the traditional view, traditional what is expected. But we also see a good number of respondents saying that they are going in for rooftop gardening, and balconies and terraces are also being used. We were also quite curious to see what kind of plants are grown in gardens in the city. We see, of course, that floral plants are the highest, followed by peppers, chilies, that's the Solanaceae, also vegetables such as tomatoes and brinjal, and followed by gourds and various kinds of beans. This was quite interesting, actually. We asked if those people who don't have edible gardens are interested in having one, and you see an overwhelming majority say yes. And we also wanted to know that if they want to have one, why they don't already have one. Of course, space was a major constraint that was reported, but lack of time and information were the other two constraints. So this leads us to think about integrating bees in the city. Like, how do we really do it? And I think what is quite apparent now is the fact that you have to work with citizens, with people living in cities, what they are interested in and what works here. So this brings us to perhaps bee types, because different bee types behave very differently. So let's talk about solitary bees. I think a lot of you know about solitary bees, but let me just quickly summarize. Solitary bees, as the name suggests, are solitary. They don't live socially like honeybees. They also don't build hives, and they don't make honey either. They require wood or exposed soil for nesting. Also, because their resource is open soil and wood, this is hard to come by in the city, and nesting resource is a constraint for these bees. It's also interesting to know that more bees are solitary than they are social. So this is a really large spectrum of bees that we're talking about when we say solitary bees. So this is our bee hotel initiative, and what we are doing now is we are setting up bee hotels all over the city. You can see the map on the left. What we hope to do through this project is to bring attention to these functional groups of taxa, that are these pollinators, especially solitary bees. And we also want to develop this initiative to work with edible gardening and urban agriculture, which is really quite possible if you look at Bangalore. We also hope to generate some interesting data on solitary bee ecology in Bangalore. It would be a first of its kind. And of course, we hope to train people to take this action forward. We've also developed an app, a phone-based app, to help people record observations of bee activity in the bee hotels. This is shortly going to go up on the Play Store. So what's next? I'll very, very quickly summarize this. We can discuss this in detail, maybe after the talk. So we want to have a more comprehensive picture of pollinators in the landscape. So of course we want to sample more, and we also want to sample non-bee pollinators. We want to look at the influence of the landscape because studies show that bees are highly sensitive to the local landscape. So we are doing this right now. We are no longer looking at the gradient. We are only looking at Bangalore city, and we are looking at connectivity and proximity to resource patches. We also want to finally start experimenting with integrating pollinators in urban agriculture. So we have a lot of plans. This is on the cards. Also, what would be interesting is to compile some more data from other sources on cultivation of pollinator-dependent crops in the landscape, I shared the graph from the Department of Economics and Statistics. We want to do a bit more of that, find some more data and see if there's anything interesting. We also had a panel discussion on pollinators and urbanscapes, and we had a variety of stakeholders there. We had bee biologists, we had ecologists, we had city planners, educationists, and also practitioners. So what we really want to do is come up with some policy recommendations for integrating bees in the city. This is acknowledgement for the support. Thank you.